Great. So I'm Alex Hughes. I'm a postdoc here. I'm also a lecturer in the MIDS program. This is work that I've done together with 3 students. So NK, who many of you know, Will Monge, and Rodenberger. And I thought that it was probably important to show that I'm going to give you the sales pitch, but back behind it is the Jupyter Notebook. And actually, I'd love to work together after this, sort of at me on Slack, if there are ways that you can help me find the problems that are in here before someone else does. That'd be good. So the project that we're working on here is continuing evidence of discrimination among local elections officials. This is with Micah Redmonds, who's at University of Georgia, Charles Crabtree, who's at University of Michigan, and then NK, Will, and Deanna, who are here or have recently graduated. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that an important part of the current national dialogue is about how group identities shape people's access and behaviors. So I'm thinking group identity is in terms of illegal immigrants. We were just talking about this, perhaps. Or in the Bay Area, what is the role of race or ethnicity in being able to rent a room in an Airbnb? Or the Department of Justice and Department of Education are currently re-examining affirmative action in college admissions. And Silicon Valley, right, there was this sort of sensational memo that went around that really took everybody around here for a couple of days worth of conversation about what group identity has to do with hiring and placement inside of companies. I'm gonna look at this from the politics side of view. And so briefly, our Democratic or Republican ideal, the way that we think that the US democracy works the best is that we have a preference aggregation mechanism, which is the vote. And the people who have the right to that vote should be able to voice that. So we also have sort of a long and a storied issue with this. I'm thinking in particular of like a long system of slavery and a long system of women disenfranchisement. But building forward, 15th Amendment during the Reconstruction era, we built out, and the courts have continued to build out the notion that one person should be entitled to a vote. Gerrymandering aside, this continues to exist. And this actually, the 15th Amendment was when? In the 1800s, and there continued to be sort of de facto discrimination in terms of Jim Crow laws in the South all the way up into the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the Supreme Court and the Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which essentially prohibits southern states or states that have legacy discrimination practices. There were several counties in Michigan where I grew up who had the same discrimination practices from requiring specific devices or tests to be able to vote, and also set up requirements that any change to the voting process had to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice to keep from sort of retrograding in the access for minority voters. Moving forward in 2013, this sort of the binding part of the VRA was eviscerated in a decision, Shelby County, and then the Supreme Court. And the justice writing for the majority here, Justice Thomas, held the conditions that originally justified the Section 5 requirements are no longer present. The extensive pattern of discrimination no longer exists. And the reasoning by the court was that given that the extensive pattern of discrimination no longer exists, there's no longer the need for this sort of supreme intervention by the federal government into the state governments. This was actually something that probably would not have been constitutional but for this extensive pattern of discrimination at the time. This feels testable, whether or not this extensive pattern of discrimination continues to exist or not. And so political scientists said, well, hold on a second here. This doesn't seem to be the case, actually. So here on observational data, Bertrand, Mahalanathan, and Safir find that for Black Americans, access to welfare is differentially available than for white Americans of the same means. King 2012 and Heron and Smith, I've got a plot down here, find that the wait times at minority districts are significantly longer than the wait times at white districts. So here on this tertiary plot, I believe this is from someone else's work, so I may get it wrong. The darker is the point, the longer was the wait time. And this is split inside of Orange County and Osceola County in Florida, the proportion white, Hispanic, and Black. So it's really clear in Osceola County. The more Hispanic is the population in that county, the longer were the wait times for the individuals who are going to vote. And this actually doesn't really lock down that it was the minority features, right? Perhaps it's just the case that The Hispanic districts were farming districts in Florida. Osceola is relatively rural. And as a consequence, there just was less availability of resources in this area. So though the effect was discriminatory, the action wasn't itself discriminatory. So this brings us to the research question that we were looking at, which was, can we set up an experiment which would let us evaluate whether or not there is continuing to be discriminatory behavior on the part of the electoral process? What we had to do is we had to find an area where politics shouldn't have played in. If there's a relationship between politics and group identity, then it could be the case that this was confounding whatever we were to measure, right? So what we looked at was an access question here. And we decided that we were going to ask local elections officials what it is that I need to vote, essentially. So we wanted to know these 4 questions. Number 1, do institutional features treat minorities differently? Number 2, are different minority classes, Latinos, blacks, and Arabs, treated equally? Are minorities treated differently in areas that are or were previously, since Shelby County eviscerated Section 5? Are they being treated differently in these Section 5 preclearance areas than in other areas? And then the 4th and last is, what role, if any, does politics play in this responsiveness? To be clear, I'll take questions at any point in time. And since I have a mic and you don't, I'll repeat them back out. Quickly, I don't want to bury the lead here. We find that street-level bureaucrats, the people who are responsible for these questions, respond less frequently to minorities. If you are a minority who is contacting this individual, you receive a response about 5% less frequently than if you were a white voter. Latino and Arab, but not black voters, are treated worse. So there's no difference between black and white senders when they send this information. But for Latinos, it's about 3.7%, and for Arab voters, it's about 11.2%, the differential here. There's no difference between VRA and voter ID geographies and the rest of the country. So this actually, I think, is probably encouraging news. It gives us an idea of why this is happening. And the districts that broke Republican, and this is the sensational part of it, districts that broke Republican or were more Republican in 2016 than they were in 2012 are just really pernicious to minorities. And we'll get to these results. So here are the headline results plotted here. In the rest of the talk, I'll describe how we got to there. So who are the street-level bureaucrats that we're thinking of? These street-level bureaucrats, local elections officials, they're the people who are responsible for the on-the-ground, day-to-day administration of the election. Most of the rest of the year, they're the county comptrollers. They're people who are dealing with payroll. They're people who, in the month of November, every second year, they get ripped out of their normal position and they're responsible for executing this huge counting. In the time that this is going on, naturally, they're very crunched for time. And I think that this plays into why we see the responses that we do. They're responsible for the application of the law, not the creation of the law. So the creation of the law happens at the Congress or at the state level. These folks don't get to make that determination. They just get to say, well, here's what the voter ID requirement is. Do you have this? Here's what the citizen requirement is. Are you this citizen? And yet in the application of this, there is room for interpretation. Not room for legislating, but room for interpretation. How are we gonna work on this? So we're gonna set up a between subjects experiment here. For those in taken experiments in causality, this just feel good. So we're gonna set up a between subjects design where we're gonna block on features that we think are predictive of responsiveness. We're gonna run 4 different ethnic primes, or ethnic or identity primes, blocked within states. So the primes are going to be white, black, Latino, and Arab, blocked within each state. In order to do this, if you remember reading the papers in Experiments in Causality, we're gonna pick off names from population lists that are representative of that group identity. So we pick off names that sound stereotypically white, or names that sound stereotypically Hispanic, or black, or Arab American. And we're gonna draw the names from these different areas. After we draw the names, we're then sending them out to Mechanical Turk. We're having Mechanical Turk workers say, what group do you think this person probably belongs to? Does this name make you angry, or does it leave you feeling nothing? And people do pretty well at categorizing the group, and they don't really seem to care what the name is. With the name together, we send this, this contact information. We say, dear local election official, where we have it, we fill in that name. We send a sentence worth of preamble, one question and then a second question, and we reply thank you. The key randomization that we really care about for identifying the effect of discrimination is here in the name that we're signing with, and this is just sort of ruse so that we try not to get caught. The way that it goes here is that we pull one from each of these three categories. So we pull, for example, like the first line here, I've been hearing quite a lot about the news. And we pull the second line, are these changes happening in California? And then we pull the third line, is there anything specific that I need to bring with me to vote? The idea here is that by running these and hitting the combinatorics, we've got 27 different messages that we're sending people that aren't systematically different, but they also aren't exactly the same, so that a system administrator can't just grep the one sentence or the three sentences that we've sent and said, oh my God, I just picked up 1,000 of these, there's something going on. Instead they pick up, what, 400? So when we compile it together, dear John Adams, I've been hearing quite a bit about identification rules on the news. Do these affect California? I'm wondering what I need to bring to vote. Thanks, Alex Hughes. So the combination of these internal languages together with the names generates 5,000 or so different treatments that we send to 6,000 people, where the only systematic feature moving here is the signatory on it. So if there's a difference, I'm willing to believe that it's the ethnic difference, not something else in here. The way that this looks and what the Jupyter Notebook's doing, we're starting with a population study. We're pulling from the Census CPS API. We're pulling from Politico. We're pulling from other public and open data sources to pull into geographies to know about what the features of that geography are like. We're then pulling, we set up a different scraper for each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. So 52 different scrapers. Off of that, we pull 6,500 or so registrar names. We then sort of unique them down to a population of about 6,100 names that we're going to send contact to. And then in the design phase here, where we're creating the treatment, we're iterating back and forth through mTurk to try and get the language right. At this point, we're running blocking and randomization. Our blocking looks like sort of like a four-means clustering that we're doing internal to each state. So the idea is that we're trying to pick geographies that are the most similar and then expose them to different versions of the treatment. That's going to be the best powered design for us, right? So we block within state so that we don't have like an Arkansas compared to a Michigan, even though they may be similar in demographics, because there are different voting histories and different rules there. Send the messages. County registrars make the determination, do I respond to this or do I not respond to this? Comes back into our database. We pull it off. We've written all the headers and we've written tracking pixels in here to know whether individuals have opened it, and also if it's been sent around to anywhere else, and then we're pulling that back and running the analysis on it. So the results, this is the top line like descriptives here. Across the bottom, this is the response rate that we receive. If anybody's worked in a direct contact environment before, getting an average response rate of about 70% is crazy. If you were sending spam, you would expect like 2% open rate, 1% click-through or something. So when we went back to the partners that we were sort of initially looking for guidance from, they said, yeah, we should do this instead of whatever it is we're doing instead. This is that the registrars are taking our emails at face value and they're doing their jobs, right? Here, this is the log responses per state. You can see, so we're reporting out in regularized numbers, but it's on a log scale. In Wisconsin and Michigan, there are 1,200 and 1,600 registrars, sort of respectively, compared to in the rest of the states, there are about 3,900. So Wisconsin and Michigan have this crazy system where every town, hamlet, shire gets their own registrar, compared to in Hawaii, there's one registrar for the whole state. In Alaska, there's one for the whole state. In California, there are 52. With this setup, the design side setup, the estimator is pretty simple, right? The treatment effect is just the difference between the people that we show the minority versus the white. So the top line would be the differences in the response rate between the people we sent the whites and the differences in the people we sent the minority signals. We can break out those minority signals into the specific classes, be they Latino, Black, or Arab, to estimate the specific effects versus whiteness here. We've seen this already, but now we've seen how we got to it. So the effect here, Arab names are responded to at 11.2% less frequently than our white names. So they're receiving a response back. These names are receiving a response back just less than half of the time, compared to white names are receiving a response back about 63% of the time. Black names, there's no difference, and Latino names, there's about a 3% difference. One of the things that we intentionally preserved in our design was the ability to map this onto a paper that was published in 2015 that was run in the 2012 election, where the researchers were sending Latino names to individuals. And so we're able to combine together our estimates, because we have a very similar design, with their estimates using this precision-weighted combination here. And so here are the estimates from the researchers in 2012. They find about a 5% decrease. We find about a 3.2% decrease, and then the precision-weighted average together brings us about a 4% penalty still paid by Latino voters in the US. Here's the parametric models sort of reporting back out the same thing. One of the reasons that when we were thinking about why might this be the case, we thought, well, maybe it's the case that the local elections officials, when they see a name, they say, I don't know anybody that looks like this in my district. And that's actually could be reasonable. In a small district in Ohio, there may be a small number of population who are not majority populations. And so we thought, well, how would we think about that? Because we built the tracking pixel into what we were sending, at least for the users who are on Microsoft or non-Google systems, we can measure whether or not they've opened the email. And what we find is that for white names, the emails are open 47% of the time. For black names, there's already a 6% decrease in whether or not that email is going to be opened without even knowing the content that's internal to the email. So this penalty starts kicking in instantly. And then if there's a 6% difference or an 11% difference overall, there's got to be another 6 or 7% difference after people have opened the email. So it's working in two chains like this. So for points 1 and 2, being a minority makes it less likely that you're going to receive a response. Being Latino and Arab makes it differentially likely. Is the effect of this different in areas that were previously covered by the VRA, right? The logic behind this was that the VRA is no longer necessary because we no longer have the prevalent pattern of discrimination, in spite of the fact that we clearly do have the prevalent pattern of discrimination. So we're going to look into 3 different voter protections that exist. One of them is voter identification rules. Many of us read about this in North Carolina. There were crazy voter ID rules that were moving around because the courts were changing their requirements just before the election went through. Section 5 preclearance, this is the requirement that you not retrograde any change you make. You need to run past the Department of Justice before you make it. And then Section 203 coverage, which is a requirement that if you have a certain preponderance of your citizenry who has less than a high school education and speaks a language which is not English. So you're thinking of essentially people who are uneducated and from a foreign country. You have to provide election materials to these individuals in that language. The takeaway is that it doesn't seem to matter. None of these protections seem to differentially change. So I'll flash through what's happening here. You can think of estimating this model, the treatment effect, the ID rules, and then the interaction between the two of those. If it were the case that the treatment were operating differently in different voter ID cases, we would expect to see differences on these interaction effects. I've got 10 models here. So each of these models has this full set together with the covariates here. And I'm only reporting out the interaction terms. And there's nothing here, right? If you correct for 10 models, there's extra nothing here. There's just no difference in what's going on. Not strict, not photo, not strict, photo, strict, not photo, strict, photo, any form of strictness. It just doesn't matter. There's no difference in the voter ID requirements and responsiveness. What about the Section 5 preclearance coverage? So this is states that had essentially legacy discriminatory practices. Here we've got the same main effect, about a 4.5% difference in being responded to if you're a minority. If you were Section 5 pre-covered, right, this is not the experimental finding, but this is the baseline, you're actually 10% more likely to respond to an email. And because we haven't assigned this, it could be one of a couple of things. Maybe it's the fact that this is just Southern genteelness, that you're responding back to every email that you get. Or maybe it's the case that this is a consequence of like a systematized email response system. We don't know the difference between those. But what we care about is perhaps the difference between, or the interaction between being a minority and being sent to one of these areas. And we find that in these areas, there's no difference, and this is a little hard. There's no more or less discrimination in Section 5 pre-covered areas. It's the same 4.5%. We find the same when we break out the ethnic categories as well, the group categories. We find that it's not more, it's not less. It's just the same as what the baseline discrimination was. Looking at Section 203, this is the minority language requirement or the foreign language requirement. In particular, we're looking at the Hispanic language requirement. Areas that meet this requirement, tend to possess fewer resources, so their response rates are 15% lower on the descriptive side, the non-experimental side. But this is probably just because they have less ability to respond. The question is, does it change the way that they respond to minority names versus white names? And we see that there's this increase in the responsiveness when we send a Latino name compared to the baseline case. So in an area where there are probably many Hispanic folks living, if we send a Hispanic name, there's more responsiveness. And I think this is starting to paint a picture about sort of what the availability is. We're thinking about this person might be here. I understand what this category of voter is like, so I'm going to respond back to this. And then we've got this last question, and it really came about because there was conversation. This is on Cinco de Mayo and was on Twitter. And there's conversation by one of the candidates that was like really out-group targeting. So out-group in terms of illegal immigrants, out-group in terms of Arab Americans, out-group in terms of Black Americans. We wondered if this has a consequence. So what we did is we looked at the interaction between the treatment indicator and the Republican vote share. And this is, we're going to do it in a sort of a particular way here. So I'll just show the models. So we matched on 2012 vote share, right? We had the Democrat-Republican vote share switch, so we matched on that. So when we include a model here, this is a fixed effect model where we've included the fixed effect for each of the areas. There's no variation then in the 2012 vote share, and so not surprisingly, we're finding that there's just no difference in the responsiveness anywhere along here. But in the same model that's matched on 2012, but then we include the 2016 vote share. This is then a measure of like, how did you break versus 2012? Did you go more Republican or did you go more liberal, more Democratic? Here we find that in areas that broke more Republican, there's this sort of like insane increase in the discrimination that's being put forward by the registrars. So for each percentage more Republican you got, you were 27% less likely to respond to an Arab name. You can think about, this is sort of projecting these models out into the open space. So along the x-axis, this is the Republican vote share. Here is a 100% Democratic vote share. Here's a 100% Republican vote share. We've got ticks for each district or the density plot for where this data is coming in, right? There's a Republican win, so we see more of the data coming in on the Republican side of things. The solid line is the probability of being responded to if you were sent a white name. The dashed line is the probability of being responded to if you were sent an Arab name instead. So in Democratic districts, these are indistinguishable. By the time the district here breaks Republican at 50%, you can now tell the difference between these two categories. And in highly Republican districts, it's very much different. If that were it, it would, how much time do we have left? 2 minutes. If that were it, it would be pretty easy to open and close. But remember earlier on, we made 27 different treatment languages. Oh, those registrars and their system administrators, they found out. And so the question becomes, in areas where they found out, what does this do to our experiment? So what happened was that a researcher at a different university checked out the same domain name that had been used in a similar experiment 3 years ago, the same one that we were replicating. And so the registrars and their system administrators had sort of rightfully put a flag. Anything that comes from this boutique email, we know that it's quacky, and so let us know. And so they got found almost instantly, and then the administrators said, well, let's just look through the records a little bit more. And in some of the states, they were able to think through what was going on, and they identified that we had also been running an experiment. So after they found out, they then sent an email to the people who found, sent an email to the National Association of Secretaries of State. The Secretaries of State then blasted back down to all the Secretaries of State, saying like, this is going on. We made the nightly news in Denver. We're a diverse research team, and some of the research team said like, what does this do for my graduating? Is this going to be a problem? It's not. But we also, we got spooky emails from other people. So what we want to make sure is that this isn't being driven by something weird happening inside of the system that the registrars figured out and then they stopped responding or something else. So we're plotting here the days since sending measured in unit seconds, right, on a log scale. So here's 1 day after we sent, 2 days, 3 days. We sent all the emails about 10:30 in the morning. And you can see sort of what you might expect to see. We're getting many responses early on. Here's the beginning of the next day. People are then going back to their email inboxes. And then like, have you ever responded to an email 3 days later? It just doesn't happen. But we can break this out by the name categories that we were sending. And we can look and see, so this is in all states. The solid line are white voters. The dashed line, which is sort of underneath it here, are black voters. The dashed line is Latino voters, and the dot dash are Arab voters. I mean, the descriptives here tell the story. You can see from the gun that Latino voters are receiving less responsiveness, Arab voters the same. We can break this down in states where there was no evidence of awareness. Same pattern sort of holds. So I think that it's not being driven by the registrar awareness of this. Sort of wrapping up here, if the problem is that registrars want to do their job, but they hold these implicit biases, right? The conversation right now is about the 1,000 little filters that keep people from getting to where they want to be. If we've identified a single filter that's like a 15% filter in success, think about how extreme that is. But just remove the names from the emails, right? Why isn't there a single web contact form on all of these states? In most, there is not. That just takes the content in, sends a response back to the individuals. Like, the policy solution to this is so easy. It's like maybe systematizes just a little bit, but we haven't done it to this point. I think that's what I've got. Thanks.
Alex, thanks very much. We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Anyone want to follow up on anything Alex has talked about there?
Yeah, Patrick.
Yes, please. We've got a
Patrick
mic down
over here, and
thanks. And then we'll.
So since you didn't see any difference from the areas where you had the VCR before and afterwards, what are your suggestions then to try and eliminate this discrimination? Anything more than just removing the name?
You know, this is hard because I think these folks are hardworking. I think they're overworked in finding that Section 5 pre-covered areas where they had a more systematic application of the email contact systems, there was increased responsiveness. In Wisconsin, for example, we don't think of Wisconsin as being like a legacy discriminatory state. This is one of the states that has 1,600 registrars or local elections officials with personal emails. Some of the emails are like quack, quack, boom at Gmail. Others are like Harold and Maud's cottage Gmail address that you're sending this to. Instead of it being like a permanent registrar at Costa Contra County, registrar at Alameda County, right? Even a simple step like that, together with maybe a name filtering, I think would change this pretty dramatically.
Okay. Just one.
Yeah, just a question on the practical significance of how, definitely strong results. How often do people contact a registrar for this kind of information, given the prevalence of web pages, newspaper publishings, pamphlets, location guides, stuff like that?
Yeah, we looked into this. So I have, how do I think about this? My girlfriend's father's wife works, right? But this is close enough that I can call the person and ask. Works in as a clerk in the office that runs the elections, and their election weeks are crazy because people are nonstop calling and nonstop emailing. They were describing like 500 emails over the course of the week that were coming in asking about what to do. Most of them are the same, like, what do I need to bring? Where do I go? Just with the mic.
Hi, a couple of questions. One is, when you send the email, is it with proper email ID, like say alexhughes@gmail.com, or is it some, I don't know, 123 something at gmail.com?
No, that's right. So what we did in creating the emails is a great question. What we did is we took the first name that we were going to sign by and the last name that we were going to sign by. We pulled the first initial, the last name, and then we drew a random digit between 20 and 40. So it would have been ahughes32 at our domain here, or right. So we built that, which means that on the envelope there was ethnicity that was being assigned to people, which is why we were able to see the 6% difference in response to white versus Arab names just on the envelope pre-open.
Okay. Well, one more question. So being an immigrant myself, so I wonder whether it's a case of discrimination, or can it also be that, okay, I can't pronounce this name, so I'm not familiar with it?
So it could be the case that in a small county in Iowa, right? Maybe there are 3,000 people who live there, and the registrar says, I think I know most people in town, and I don't know someone with this name. We can't rule that out. I don't think that changes the interpretation of what's happening. It doesn't change the descriptive result, at least. If it were the case that you were to move to the small county in Iowa, it still would be the case if you sent that email that they would have that same response that they just manifest here. Why is hard? Mechanisms are hard, right?
Okay. All right. Let's take. I'm going to take maybe just one more question. Just time. The gentleman there, just behind in the blue jacket.
Hi, Alex. So when when you did the web scraping to find the names of the people to whom you wanted to send these emails, did you think about sort of reverse engineering the race or ethnic status of those people to look at whether the underlying effect was party or the underlying effect itself was race?
That's right. So that's what's happening right now. So if there's an API that's built out right now. It's Name Prism, which takes names in and assigns back out probability distributions over the categories that those individuals are in. We've run that and we've come back with it. It's overwhelmingly white, so it's like on the order of 90% white in the representation at this area, with secondary categories being black at 7%, Latino at 3%, and like negligible Arab representation. One of the things that just made me think of here, we scraped the emails in a way that we're pretty sure worked 3 days before we sent these, so 5 days before the election, 7 days before the election, and we still had like 3% of the emails bounce, meaning that like this is the formal contact mechanism to get a hold of these people, and it didn't work.
All right.
Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much.